The Ohio Chamber of Commerce, the Ohio Manufacturers Association, the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association, children's hospitals, law enforcement groups, and the Ohio Republican Party are opposed to Issue 2. I talked with Republican former State Representative Rick Carfagna, now with the Chamber, and Reverend John Coates, the president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance of Columbus and Vicinity. Reverend Coates, I want to ask you, there's already, as I mentioned, an illicit market for marijuana in Ohio. Why not capitalize that and make it legal and tax it and potentially drive drug dealers out of business?
Well, there's several problems. First of all, we're not going to drive drug dealers out of business when recreational marijuana, if it's legalized, youth will not be able to go to dispensaries in order to buy marijuana. Those drug dealers will now target a youth market. We've just have redirected or would redirect drug dealers to sell marijuana to our young people, and that marijuana could be laced with God knows what, including fentanyl.
But that's another thing that this would do, is it would regulate marijuana and actually put some guardrails on it, according to the supporters of Issue 2. So it could potentially be safer.
Not illegal marijuana. The only safe marijuana would be the marijuana that would be sold in the stores. And that's strong, too.
Let me ask you, Rick, you mentioned the numbers and the concerns about worker safety and productivity. A study from Ohio State University's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center in August of last year showed that recreational marijuana legalization appears to increase state employment growth. There may have been virtually no impact on productivity and perhaps a small positive effect in their study. And also, the supporters of Issue 2 have said that the stats that you just cited, which I cited to them before,
sure,
can be misleading. So does all this suggest that the fear of the loss of productivity really is maybe a little overblown here?
Well, Karen, look, we have a window of opportunity. We have tens of thousands of jobs coming to the state of Ohio in the next 3 to 5 years. They've already been announced, 4 mega projects alone. And when you look at those types of jobs, by and large, they're going to be in manufacturing. We're talking about precision work. We're talking about construction, thousands of construction jobs to even build the facilities. We're talking about using heavy machinery like forklifts. And so all of those are precarious situations where if somebody is under the influence of a substance that you've just made more readily available, it's going to lead to bad things. Common sense tells us that.
The Social Equity and Jobs Fund, which is part of this, where the tax revenue is going to go, was designed to help people who are most directly and adversely impacted by marijuana-related laws. So, Reverend Coates, I want to ask you, many of those are people of color. And so why can't you support a program that seeks to really help those people build back their lives?
It sounds nice. It has a real nice wrapping on it. But the reality is that this language would take revenue from marijuana and would employ convicted drug dealers and their families in order to get into the marijuana business. Now, if you're going to spend money to give someone a job that might be disadvantaged or disabled in some way, why not allow them to train in the building trades or some other industry that we're in need of within our state? Why make them drug dealers?
Would you have less of a problem with this if indeed that revenue would go to something like a program for further education or something?
Absolutely, but that's not what's within this language. And the best thing to do is to vote no on this, and let's go back to the drawing board.
Can I add to that?
Of course.
So, when you look at the structure of how it's taxed and where the money is going to, not a single penny of this is going to law enforcement. And people on both sides of this issue agree, we don't want people under the influence driving. But there's nothing for enforcement in this. There's a small amount of money that will go back to municipalities and townships. Now, if that trickles down to if they even have a police force, great. But nothing is going to the State Highway Patrol. Nothing is going to the county sheriff's offices. That's a really big problem. We need money for law enforcement to be able to do their jobs to make sure that this is being done responsibly.
I've asked the supporters of Issue 2 about that, and specifically they've said that this is funding that would be directed by the qualifications for the social equity program, would be directed by the Department of Development, and indeed the money could go to local communities to put toward law enforcement. You've said before that it's not your job to fix this piece of legislation, but would you advocate to lawmakers that they make some changes in where that funding would go?
So the Ohio Chamber is doing two things currently. One, we are taking a look and we are identifying what we perceive to be the flaws in this bill, why it's a bad idea to enable recreational marijuana. The other thing that we're doing is we're trying to be constructive, and we're trying to go through and make red lines and try to identify the flaws in the bill that, should this pass, we can go to the legislature and work constructively with people on the other side of this issue to say, look, it makes sense to put these certain guardrails in. This, we want this to be rolled out in a responsible manner since the people have given their okay for it. So we are planning to work constructively to identify and to relate what we perceive to be the policy flaws to the legislature in the event that they're willing to make those changes, make those fixes.
You've got people of faith and clergy members who are on both sides of issue one. On issue two, Reverend Coates, you and some other of your colleagues here in the Columbus area have come together against issue two. Why weigh in on that issue? Why do you feel strongly enough that you need to put your voice in on that?
Because we pastor people, we minister to communities, and we see the impact that drugs have on our community from day in and day out. People have been smoking marijuana chronically for some time, and we know of the damage that it does. It's a gateway drug, and it leads into use of other drugs. We see the effects of that on people's lives. So with us, there's no question than to oppose this type of legislation that would encourage more drug use in our community.
But it can be pointed out that there's plenty of damage that's done by legal substances like alcohol, like tobacco. Why not oppose those and be concerned about what happens with those?
You mentioned alcohol, and you're absolutely right. There's lots of damages that have been done. The state has aggressively have dealt with prescription doctors prescribing opioids, if I can say it. and with other drugs. But what about alcohol? You're not allowed to drink and drive in our state, but yet you can smoke and drive?
Well, the law doesn't change. The issue two does not change the laws on driving under the influence.
Yes, but how do you police it? I mean, we can smell it, but can you?
There's no BAC for THC.
Right.
You cannot measure like you do blood alcohol content. You can't do that for marijuana, which is a big problem.
I want to ask you about that specifically on employers. They can still have drug-free workplaces. They can still drug test their employees. So why not allow this and allow, of course, employers to do as they see
Well,
fit?
and I will acknowledge they did take the employer protections that are currently in the medical marijuana statute, and they did kind of cut and paste them into this proposed statute. We appreciate that. We want to ensure that workplace protections remain, that employers have the discretion not only to test employees, but to enact drug-free workplaces and zero-tolerance policies. That's preserved. We appreciate that. But we think that there are other bigger flaws in this bill, including private property rights, which we haven't even talked about, not just about policing your own employees, but also policing the people coming into your premises.
And Karen, I would add that it's drug users, marijuana smokers, or would-be marijuana smokers need to be aware of that, is that employers will have discretion, which means that the law may say you can use recreational marijuana, but don't test positive.
And there's going to be a big educational campaign needed for employers to understand if you don't have these policies in place, you better get cracking, you better put them in there, and you better be ready to enforce them.
Real quickly, property rights, you mentioned that. This doesn't affect if an employer, if a landlord wants to say you can't smoke it here, they can still do that.
We think that the wording is ambiguous. I know that there's some mention of it in the statute, but we think it's ambiguous. If you think about shopping malls, restaurants, amusement parks, any other private properties that are large open public spaces, we would want to make sure that those private property owners have the discretion to completely ban cannabis use and cannabis possession throughout the entire premises. I don't know that it's absolutely crystal clear in the current legislation, and that's one of the things that we're going to want to talk to the legislature about. Much in the same way that right now, you can put a placard on your front door to say you are not going to bring any firearms onto this private property. That is something with all the expansive gun bills that have happened in this state, that is one constant that has remained for the business community. We appreciate that. We want to make sure that that same latitude is given with cannabis use and cannabis possession.
There are 19 states with legislation that legalizes recreational marijuana. Again, this is the only weekend for early voting, and it ends on Sunday. Election Day is Tuesday.